The title of the book, Native America Discovered and Conquered, Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and Manifest Destiny. And this was published last year?
It came out in hardback in 2006, and it's been in paperback since just a little over a year now.
Yeah. And this is my personal copy. I thought I'd better try and read as much as I could before you came in to be our guest here, Bob.
Thank you.
And picked this up at Powell's. If anybody wants to get one of their own, they're available there. And the issue of Manifest Destiny has had a big impact on Indian people, of course, from the very start of occupation here in North America, the Americas. And it's really, isn't it a Christian concept? Didn't it come out of the Christian church, Bob?
Yes, what my book is about is the original international law that European Christians used to claim the whole rest of the world. And today we call that legal principle the Doctrine of Discovery. And so my book is about how the United States adopted this Doctrine of Discovery from Europe, from the English colonies, how our American states, our American federal government made this part of law to control Native people, to control the tribal nations, and like you said, to acquire all their land. Now, the longest chapter in my book is how I contrast or compare the Doctrine of Discovery, this international law principle, to Manifest Destiny. And so that's how I incorporate Manifest Destiny and try to prove that the idea, this American Manifest Destiny, that the United States was destined by God to cross this whole continent and to own everything, it came from this European religious and racial, if we want to use that word, and ethnocentric idea that Europeans were superior to the rest of the world and had the right to control Native peoples, indigenous peoples everywhere, and to acquire their land and assets.
And as I understand it, this happened through the Pope issuing a papal bull, or several papal bulls.
Yes.
Claiming that the humans they encounter are to be subjugated or made into slaves and accept Christianity as their religion at their peril if they didn't.
If they didn't.
I mean, that's a real oversimplification. But these papal bulls had a major impact on the Native peoples.
They did.
Because it made us powerless, really. No rights, not even being recognized as
subject to
humans.
European Christians. So, yes, my book, and there's other places you can read about the papal bulls, of course, there are dozens of them that literally divided the earth for Europeans to conquer. That's why I have the word conquest in the title of my book, because they considered when they showed up and put their flag and their cross in the soil, you've seen those paintings.
That's all they had to do to conquer the people.
Well, exactly right. I'm not kidding. That is exactly what they thought. By merely arriving and sticking that flag and cross in the soil, they were claiming their rights over the Native people, over the lands, and over the rights of the Native people, the human rights, the political rights, the sovereign rights over tribal governments. And that is exactly what they were engaged in doing. And the Pope, various popes, 1436, Pope Eugenius II granted the Canary Islands to Portugal for Portugal to convert them, Christianize them, and civilize them. And later in the 1450s, Pope Nicholas V granted Portugal the power to now, in Africa, as Portugal was exploring down the west coast of Africa, they asked the Pope to grant them ownership of these lands. So in these papal bulls, not only did the Pope grant Portugal the power to civilize and Christianize these Africans, but it gave Portugal title, jurisdiction, and sovereignty over these African peoples. So Spain wanted these same papal bulls here in the New World, and once Columbus found these lands here in 1492, what does Spain do? Well, they go to the new Pope, who was named Alexander VI, and he divides the world in half from the North Pole to the South Pole, grants Portugal all rights east of that line to explore, conquer, and acquire sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title, and grants Spain the same rights west of that line. So literally, they were dividing the world up for Portugal and Spain. Pretty good if you were Portugal and Spain. Not so good if you were the indigenous people living in these lands.
Well, except one side of the meridian only included Brazil. The other side included most of the Americas.
Exactly.
Right?
People may wonder why Portuguese is the official language of Brazil. Well, it's because, like you just said, that part of South America fell on Brazil's side of that line. or Portugal's side of that line,
Portugal's
excuse me.
side,
But
yeah.
Portugal also got Africa and a lot of Asia. You remember the movie Shogun? Maybe some of your audience remember that movie and that book with Richard Chamberlain. When he led the Dutch into the Japans, the Portuguese people said, you can't come here. The Pope gave this part of the world to us. So that's those papal bulls that we were just talking about. Boy, that Pope was pretty powerful.
Yeah, and now, you know, now that we've got the effects of the papal bulls, there has been talk. People want to reverse these, or think that somehow by reversing them, it's going to aid tribal sovereignty. Or have you heard of this, Bob? Or is that what you would like to see happen?
I have heard of this movement. I know there's a group called the 13 Indigenous Grandmothers, and they have been to the Vatican, and they were performing ceremonies out on the grounds right there while the Pope was doing some service. And in fact, the Swiss guards came out and almost arrested these Indigenous
sure.
grandmothers because they were smudging. I think most of these Indigenous grandmothers are Catholic to boot, so they were there, you know, to pray, but they were smudging and stuff, and boy, these guards just about arrested them. That happened about like 4 or 5 months ago, I think.
Yeah.
But just this July, the Episcopal Church in its triannual conference in Los Angeles passed a resolution against the Doctrine of Discovery and asked the Queen of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury to withdraw the charters England gave John Cabot to explore North America in 1496 and 1497. So far, nothing's happened.
Kudos to the Episcopal Church for repudiating this policy. I thought it was great for them to come out just this last June or something.
Absolutely. It really started
in their
with
main conference, their national conference, and made that decision.
It started with, I think, only really a few Episcopalian person in the Archdiocese of Maine, and I think in October 2007, the Archdiocese voted against this, the Doctrine of Discovery, and now they got the National Episcopalian Church to ask the Church of England to repudiate those charters.
Well, but the Church of England claimed that they didn't exist at the time the papal bulls were written, so they feel like they don't have any jurisdiction.
Well, the charters they're asking them to take back is the ones that
From Cabot?
King Henry VII and that the Englishman John Cabot used. Yes.
Yeah, that was later.
But I mean,
But we need to convince the Catholic Church now
Well,
to
exactly.
make the same move that the Episcopals.
Well, and I want to give more credit to other people besides just the Indigenous grandmothers. Chief Oren Lyon of the Onondagas in New York, upstate New York, he and others have been to the Vatican, I believe, and they've met with some high-ranking bishop. They've never talked to the Pope, I don't think, but they have met with a bishop, and this point has been made directly to the hierarchy of the church.
But no reply? Or
No reply yet.
Yeah.
You asked me earlier, well, what did I think about this? I think that this would be a fabulous educational moment for the world, but I do not know, and I kind of doubt that anything would change the day after the church withdrew these papal bulls, or if the Church of England withdraws these charters. I mean, would anybody lose their title? Would tribes get land back? I don't think there would be any concrete impact, but I think it would have an enormous educational moment for the entire world if something like that were to happen.
Yeah, certainly, because the church is so big, and it would be heard around the world if something like that happened. So
It would be.
for those of our viewers who want to get behind this push, Oren Lyons, the Chief Oren Lyons, I know he's with the Seventh Generation Fund. He's on their commission or something, or board. But he's from New York?
He's a traditional chief of the Onondaga Nation, which is one of the 6 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy.
Yeah. We're talking about manifest destiny and the settlement of the Americas, how that came about, with our guest Robert Miller, professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. And I can't remember where we left off, Robert, but I remember saying something about these big words like usufructuary rights. Now, let's say you occupy a piece of land for 10,000 years. You've established those rights in that area. Is that true?
Yes, tribes talk about their aboriginal rights in the areas where they either roamed for food sources or lived or used for hunting, etc. So a usufructuary right for your audience is just a use right on land. And so even after Europeans came here and put their flag and cross in the soil, they still recognized that tribal people and Indian people had a use right on their lands until they sold their lands to either the United States or England or France. But the moment those Europeans showed up, they made a claim that allegedly limited the rights of the native people. They could only deal with this European country that had discovered them, as if the native people were lost. As we all know, it's the Europeans that were wandering around lost.
Yes.
But they found native people, and with a flag and a cross in the soil, they claimed rights over them.
And they claimed to have moral superiority and various other superior intellect and everything else.
Well, we know the use of the word civilization, and in my book I break this doctrine of discovery down into 10 constituent elements and that make up the doctrine. And two of the elements, one is Christianity and one is civilization. So what you just said is true. Europeans thought they were superior to native people, both just because they were Europeans, because they were allegedly so educated, but also because of their religions. And they thought that Christianity was superior to any spiritual beliefs and religions that tribes had. So it was ethnocentrism in the worst way.
Yeah. And it was able to perpetuate itself with the aid of the courts. The U.S. courts took these Christian doctrines, and I can't remember now which law or which court decision that actually included the word Christian. I think it was Macintosh versus Johnson, had the word Christian in somehow reference to ownership of the land. Am I right? Or
yes, that's what the United States Supreme Court adopted the doctrine of discovery, this international law as American law in 1823 in the Johnson v Macintosh case that you just mentioned. But there are dozens, if not hundreds, of state court cases in which state courts also adopted this international law principle, and they used what you just said. There's a Tennessee Supreme Court case from 1833, I think, that said that the law of Christendom is that Christians can come claim rights over the savage native people of the world. So all these state court judges, the U.S. Supreme Court, the United States government, they relied on this justification of the doctrine of discovery and their superiority over us. What a convenient argument. And what a false argument.
yeah, it had no basis other than the way they saw themselves.
Absolutely. The court says, and of course the irony of this is how do you enforce such an odd-sounding thing? The Supreme Court in Johnson v. Macintosh, the case you just cited, they said this power of discovery has been enforced by the power of the sword. So apparently if Europeans hadn't had gunpowder and guns, then maybe...
yeah, darn.
Yes, the power of the sword.
Oh, well. Well, I know that we want to try and go to the phones in just a few minutes, so please call in if you have questions for any of us on the panel. Bob, I want to make sure that we cover everything that you wanted to cover. What have we missed talking about manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery? You know,
well, your audience,
what would you like to tell
I mean, your audience might be interested a little bit in how I even got first involved in this, because my chief called me in, I think, early 2003, and the Lewis and Clark bicentennial was going on. You probably both remember the 200-year hoopla about Lewis and Clark. Well, they wanted tribes to be involved, and Bobby Connor, again from the Umatilla tribe, she was heavily involved. Your tribe was one of the official tribes that got involved with the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. But tribes were not interested in calling it a celebration. They wanted to commemorate this event, but they wanted to tell their stories. So my tribe also wanted to get involved. I think ultimately 41 tribes appointed official representatives to be part of that National Council of the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. So that's when I got involved, and I thought I would write about Thomas Jefferson and I would write about Lewis and Clark. And I thought that I could prove that they had used the doctrine of discovery here in the Pacific Northwest, and that was how the United States had claimed the Pacific Northwest. So that's where I didn't plan on writing a book, but I started researching this. That is my first book, and right now it's my only book. I have one being reviewed right now about Indian economic development, tribal economic development. So I have written a second one, but it's not out yet.
Yeah.
But so that's my baby, and you know, I really just had a lot of fun researching and reading Thomas Jefferson, reading the journals of Lewis and Clark, and just saw the use of this international law to make claims over the native people here in the Pacific Northwest. When they encountered your nation, when they encountered the other tribes out here, what were Lewis and Clark doing? They were claiming the territory. Pure and simple. In fact, let me just tell you one point. I mean, I keep talking about the flag and the cross, because we know that's what Columbus and those guys did.
Yeah.
But Meriwether Lewis carried a branding iron with him, and it's at the Oregon Historical Society. It says U period S period CAPT period, because he was a United States captain in the Army when he made the trip. And it says M period Lewis. That original artifact is at the Oregon Historical Society. But they would use that to brand his name on trees, and the other men would take their knives and carve their names on trees when they were out here in the Pacific Northwest. So what were they doing? Well, that was a lot better than just sticking a flag and a cross in the soil, wasn't it? So
yeah, claiming it with your name on the property.
Absolutely. You brand that into a tree, that's going to be there 20, 30, 40 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Lewis and Clark were doing exactly what President Jefferson told them to do, and they were claiming the Pacific Northwest for the United States. That's what that expedition was mostly about.
Yeah. Well, you're learning some new history tonight, folks, and we are almost ready to go to our phones, I think at about 10 till or so. Yeah, get your phones warmed up, and we'll give you the number there. I think we have the scroll for the number. And call in, and we'll get you hooked up as we continue our discussion here. Now, Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on this trip, right? Do we have a call already? No. But he was using, you think he had an underlying doctrine of discovery that wasn't really overt, but kind of hidden in the plans there for the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Yes, you mentioned, and I've already talked about this Johnson v. Macintosh case from 1823. And so when I started my research, when my chief called me and said, do you want to be involved, I knew that Johnson v. Macintosh was 20 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition. But I also knew that Jefferson was this highly intelligent man who had gone to college, and I knew he would have known the history, the European history behind Johnson v. Macintosh. So I took a gamble that I could end up writing something that would make my law school happy. And so my book, before I wrote my book, it was a great big long law review article, which is what normally professors write, are these heavily footnoted long...
More footnotes than article, really.
Yes, boring as... But that's what I wrote first. So at first I wrote a 120-page law review article that then I turned into my book. So I found out what Jefferson was doing, and while he, like you said, he didn't say it right out in the open, but his intent was that Lewis and Clark would help establish, and expand the United States to establish our claim to the Oregon country. So the Doctrine of Discovery was used to prove that the United States owned the Oregon country. Forget that tribes were here, forget that Indian people were here. The United States was arguing with England, Russia, and Spain over who owned the Pacific Northwest. And ultimately we prevailed. We, the United States.
And that means we probably have a caller. Hello, caller. Are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right. Well, first, thank you for this very intelligent and insightful discussion. These are subject matters I think that the majority of the people in this country aren't aware of, and this book ought to go a long way towards bringing that forward. But before the video clip, you talked a little bit about all the different things that people are doing to bring this information forward, and everybody you mentioned was, I think, Eastern United States folks. I was wondering if there's anybody out here in the western part of the country, other than yourself, that is involved with this.
I forget the name of it, but there are some Lakota people involved with this. I believe the name Carter Camp. I hope I'm not wrong, but you can find this on the line, on the web. And I forget the name of his organization, but they have, I think, something you can sign on the web, a petition to do something about the Doctrine of Discovery. And then someone that both David and I know, Stephen Newcomb, is a Shawnee person, same as I, so I guess he and I are related. And he has written a book very recently about the Doctrine of Discovery. He looks primarily at the Christian side of the Doctrine of Discovery. And I'm now blanking on the, his book
I
is
have the
called
title.
Pagans in Paradise, I think.
Pagans in Paradise.
And he works for the Sequan tribe, or in, I think, Riverside, California. So, and he has worked with Oren Lyons, the chief of the Onondaga Nation that we talked about earlier, and I think they have been together to the Vatican. So there are other people, other native people, that are concentrating on this too.
Well, that's great information. And one other quick question before, maybe you get some other calls. You said that this Doctrine of Discovery was was papal, so it was Roman Catholic. Is there anything comparable with the Protestant churches at the time?
Well, let me think. When Henry VII sent John Cabot forth, he of course was still a Catholic king, so he was using the Doctrine of Discovery. But a good example is his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, when she chartered the first English attempts to colonize in North America. She gave charters to Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And for both of them, she complied, even though she was Protestant and was already excommunicated by the Pope. She directed them to follow this emerging international law, this Doctrine of Discovery. And she directed Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert to go where no Christian prince has yet been and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. And then her successor, James I, who of course was a Protestant king too, when he chartered the Virginia Company to establish what became the first permanent English settlement, of course, at Virginia, he gave the identical same order. He told the Virginia Company to go where no Christian prince has yet been and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. So in my book, I trace how the Doctrine of Discovery came to this continent from Europe, and how then these English kings and other countries, of course, used the Doctrine of Discovery too.
Well, I noticed in your book you mentioned Jefferson and those folks. Now, were they aware of this Doctrine of Discovery? Did they utilize this as any part of their governing?
Absolutely. That's what I mentioned was exciting to me, because I found a lot of Thomas Jefferson's work and a lot of his writings were about this authority that the United States had acquired by treaty from France. Do you know what we bought in Louisiana Territory, folks? I should make this one point. Every American misunderstands this, and every history book you read is false on this point. You all have heard the statement that we paid 3 cents an acre for the land in the Louisiana Territory, and it was the greatest real estate deal in history. Every history book says those two things. Both of those are false. We bought from France not the land. France didn't even pretend to own the land in the Louisiana Territory. What France claimed was this legal power of the Doctrine of Discovery, that it could be the only country to buy the land from the natives. That's what we bought from France, was an option to buy the land later from the tribes. And you folks, you all already know the facts in the back of your mind. After the Louisiana Purchase, we spent the next 100 years signing treaties with tribes in the Louisiana Territory and now buying land from the tribes. And in fact, someone calculated in an article in 1947 that the United States paid the tribes themselves $300 million for the land that's in the Louisiana Territory.
Oh, thank you for that information. I'll get the rest of this off the air. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for your call. And we just have a few minutes left, but if we have another caller. Hello, caller. Are you there? While we push the buttons. Hello, caller. They might have hung up on us. We did have a caller. Adam, did you have any? Oh.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, my name is Melissa, and I'm a full-blooded Native American. I would like to thank you, first of all, for this show. I discovered it. I'm new to Portland, and I enjoy it. I'm studying law right now, and I come from a county in Washington State that has 5 tribes within it. And the courts continue to abuse the federal acts that we have designed to protect our mothers and our children. And I'm studying because I'm super interested and vigilant about protecting our people. And there are laws put forth to protect our people. And I think one of the worst things that we continue to endure at the hands of the court is because of their ignorance and because of what the history books have continued to say about us. I would like, during my lifetime, to see it changed. The law, they're ignorant, and they don't care to understand us. They don't want to understand us, and they are sure in the heck not any friendlier now than they were at Manifest Destiny.
Well, you know, we could have had this subject as the whole topic of our show and cover it with an hour easily. You know, there's Indian law over here, and then there's the law for everybody else over here. And our status as Indian people is a legal state. It's not a racial designation. Our status in the states is a legal status. It's not based on our race. So you have Indian law, a whole section over here that doesn't apply to all the other people over here. It's a very unique situation.
Well, and I'd like to comment on what I think the caller was talking about, and this is something I've learned from my book. We can read American history. It's usually written by some older white gentleman, right? And so it has a particular viewpoint.
Right.
The victory of the winner, the victory of a culture that's not native or that's not gender specific or female or anything. So American history needs to be written by people like me, people like you, people like the caller, people like African Americans, anyone. We need a fuller viewpoint of American history. And so that's in my book. Here's something that everyone thinks they know a lot about, the Lewis and Clark expedition. But here's an entirely new way to look at it through the lens of the law and understand the doctrine of discovery. And that's just opened my eyes that we need all sorts of people writing history and researching history, etc.
Yeah, we encourage you, caller.
Okay, well, in my introduction to law class that I'm in right now, the textbook, tribal treaties or jurisdiction, none of that is even touched. And I think people who are taking those classes need to see why they need to be seen and understood. Okay. They need to be treated with sensitivity.
Yes.
You need to come to Lewis and Clark Law School and study Indian law under me.
That's right.
Well, I think I'm going to buy your book and I'm going to look into it.
I'm sorry, but we've run out of time. We had to cut you off and certainly encourage our viewers to follow up on the issues that we've talked about tonight and learn more about what really happened in the history of North America.